his office was raided and his home was raided, and he and his company were being sued for money laundering, in short. The maximum sentence for operating an unlicensed money transmitter and money laundering is like 30 years or so.
Wow.
You know, it was a real big threat to basically his life, at least his freedom. So I opened the Genesis book with a short story on eGold. eGold was a project by Douglas Jackson. We're now talking like 97. And he also wanted to create a digital cash for the internet. So what eGold was a digital payment system that was backed by gold. Anyone could make an account there using only an email address, no KYC email type of stuff. So then you could send it to someone else, and then that person would have to claim on the gold in default.
So very, very similar to how fiat currency started in the sense of it was a claim check on gold in a vault. This is a digital claims check of gold on the internet. Right?
Yeah, pretty similar indeed. But it was probably also being abused by, criminals in one way or another.
Which is true. I mean,
which is true. And eGold wasn't worse than others.
Yeah, I mean, today most crime occurs using the US dollar, right?
Right.
It blows my mind what they did to this guy. It's like this guy was operating in good faith. You know? They really weaponized the system. I mean, this guy's a doctor. He went to medical school.
Yeah, he was a doctor in the army at some point.
Yeah, he served his country.
To your point, as you pointed out, Douglas Jackson really kind of tried to play well with regulators. Mm-hmm. It wasn't his goal to create something that criminals could use. It was his goal to create an easily accessible form of digital cash that was backed by gold. So he tried to play ball with regulators. He reached out to them. He worked with them. And every time he got a request, he just did what they asked. He gave them what they asked. But still, at some point, the Secret Service raided his office and his home. He was sued for not having that license. And then he struck a plea deal, not realizing that also meant he would never be able to get that license. But that was the result. And as a consequence, eGold shut down.
Welcome to the next episode of my podcast series with Aaron Van Weerdem, where we discuss his book, the Genesis book, and all of the technologies and research that led up to the creation of Bitcoin. Today, we're going to talk about eCash and trustless timestamps. Welcome, Aaron.
Thanks. Back again.
So last episode, we spoke a lot about David Chaum and some of the contributions he made, but we didn't really speak about eCash, which is probably his biggest and most notable achievement. So let's dive into that.
Yeah. So as we discussed, Chaum was a cryptographer at Berkeley, I believe we established, right? Mm-hmm. And he was very interested in privacy or protecting privacy in a digital age. And he was the first one to think of this as well in the context of cash. So he wanted to create a digital form of cash. And cash in this context means a form of money that you can spend anonymously. So a form of money that you can spend without anyone else knowing that you made a payment. Even the person you're paying doesn't need to know who you are, right? They just need to know that they were paid. So indeed, much like physical cash, the same level of privacy, or at least the same promise of privacy as physical cash in the digital world.
Let me read a quote from your book here. Here you say, "It was also Chaum who recognized that it could not yet offer privacy for a very particular type of communication of value."
That's right. Yeah. So Chaum invented that. He invented a way to do digital cash. Specifically, this required blind signatures. So this was a variation on cryptographic signatures, digital signatures, authentication. And the way it worked, or the analogy that he used is, I'll explain the analogy, yeah? So let's imagine you have a bank, and rather than this bank issuing cash, it's actually the users that create the cash. So a user creates like a dollar bill, but then it gives this dollar bill to the bank, and the bank signs it to make it valid. Okay? Now, a dollar bill has a serial number. So if the bank would do that, if the bank would validate the bill and you then pay someone and that person gives the dollar bill back to the bank, which, by the way, is necessary to prevent double spending. So this is a difference between physical dollar bills and digital dollar bills. With the digital dollar bills, because it can be copied, right? It's digital information, so it can be copied. You can take one digital dollar bill and copy it a million times and send it to a million different people. To avoid that, every dollar bill can only be spent once. And the way that's checked is by the bank itself. So the moment you receive the dollar, you give it to the bank, you deposit it immediately. And then the bank will see if this dollar bill was already deposited. If it's not deposited, the bank will say, yep, this is a valid dollar, you were paid, and then you can give whatever product or service you were offering in exchange, right? So that's the order of things. So Matty, you go to a bank, you create a digital dollar yourself, you have the bank sign it to make it valid, bank gives it back to you, then you give it to me, and then before I give you whatever I'm selling you, candy for $1, whatever, then I go to the bank myself and I say, hey, I got paid this $1. Can I deposit this in my account? And the bank will say, yes, this is a valid dollar. We haven't seen this before. We issued it once. It's our signature, so you're good. And then I give you the candy. Now, this is bad for privacy. The way I just described it is bad for privacy because these dollar bills have serial numbers. Like you need to create a unique serial number for the dollar bill, and then the bank gives it to you, you give it to me, I give it to the bank knows exactly that you paid me $1 because they
know who issued it and they know who
I must be the first person you paid it to because otherwise that other person would have checked it with the bank. So now you got horrible privacy. It's awful.
I call it pretty bad privacy.
PBG, the GBP.
Yeah.
GBP. Why is this so hard for me?
It's because you're Dutch. PBP.
Pretty bad privacy. PBP. So Chaum didn't want that. So he added another layer. He added a layer of encryption. And this is called blind signatures. Now, the analogy he made was with carbon paper. So, when you send an email, it has CC, that stands for carbon copy, and that's because back in the days, people used carbon paper. I don't think it's as popular anymore as it used to be, but that's what it means. So what happens actually is you create the digital dollar. Matty, you create the digital dollar like you did before, and it has a serial number. Now you put it in an envelope. This you give to the bank. And then the bank signs the envelope, gives it back to you, and now you take the dollar bill out of the envelope, and the signature is still on the dollar, right? You use carbon paper. There's carbon paper inside of the envelope, so now the signature is on the dollar. Now you give it to me, and now I give it to the bank, and the bank will tell me it's valid, but the bank didn't know the serial number in the first place because the envelope was around it. So the analogy here is the envelope is a layer of encryption. So it's called blind signature. So you encrypt basically the dollar bill, but the bank signs that in such a way that the signature still translates to the original dollar.
So this is the concept of blind signing and a blinding key, essentially.
Yeah, precisely. So that way, when I get paid, I give the dollar to the bank. The bank has no idea who paid me, but I can still give you the candy. It's still a valid payment. So this is what David Chaum invented. This is called blind signatures, as you pointed out. Mm-hmm. And he first published this in a paper, I believe in 1982. I might be off by a year or two.
I think it was 83, I believe. The talented cryptographer solved the problem in 1983.
1983.
Blind signatures for untraceable payments.
Right.
Still well before I was alive.
A couple of years before I was alive as well, yes. So people were thinking about this very early on. That's worth mentioning.
That is
that's how far digital cash goes back.
Yeah.
So and specifically David Chaum was thinking about it at the time. So he was a true pioneer.
This is to me like peak David Chaum. And I have this page, like in this book here, I have about half of the page highlighted because I thought it was so profound and I really wanted to talk to you about it. Because, thinking so far ahead, all of these things that David Chaum spoke about and realized and have really come to fruition in society. I mean, the cypherpunks and the people that inspired the cypherpunks even, right? It goes even beyond that, right? They were thinking about all these things. They were looking at the systems and the processes and all of the way these things were being set up. And they realized that, hey, this could turn into a dystopian nightmare. So I'm going to read some of this just because I think it's so powerful.
Absolutely.
Chaum found the prospect of mass surveillance of payments as worrisome as the mass surveillance of any other type of communication, and for good reason. Someone's transaction history arguably reveals as much personal information as their text communication does, if not more. The foundation is being laid for a dossier society in which computers could be used to infer individuals' lifestyles, habits, whereabouts, and associations from data collected in ordinary consumer transactions, Chaum warned. Uncertainty about whether data will remain secure against abuse by those maintaining or tapping it can have a chilling effect, causing people to alter their observable activities. As computerization becomes more pervasive, the potential for these problems will grow dramatically. The choice between keeping information in the hands of individuals or of the organizations is being made each time any government or business decides to automate another set of transactions, Chaum explained. In one direction lies unprecedented scrutiny and control of people's lives. In the other, secure parity between individuals and organizations. The shape of society in the next century may depend on which approach predominates. That is like, wow, how powerful is that? That's from like the 80s, right?
Yeah.
It's like, and to think about today with all of these, big tech corporations and government spying with the NSA, collecting massive amounts, troves of data on people unconstitutionally, knowing every little detail about their life. Google is probably the worst example of this. You make a Google account and they save and monitor every single search you make. They know what issues matter to you. And they basically can program what is fed to you when you search for questions. They can push certain things up, push propaganda, push a certain message. I think Chaum was right on with a lot of this stuff. I mean, we are living the reality of this in a lot of different ways.
Yeah. And it's worth mentioning that one of the reasons Chaum thought digital cash was so important, why he thought it was so important to create something like this, is because at this time, again, we're speaking like the 80s, it was not obvious yet how the internet would evolve. So what a lot of people thought at that time was that the internet would monetize itself basically through payments. So every website you visit, every search engine, every search you do, every link you click, like you would pay for it. That's how websites would sustain themselves, by offering their services in return for payment. Now we of course know that advertising is a much bigger income stream for many online services. But at that time it was thought you would pay for everything, and therefore it was so crucial that that you could make these anonymous payments. So it wasn't, otherwise everything you do online could be tracked. Now we're in that world anyways, more or less.
Yeah.
But at least this was one of the concerns, one of the reasons why people like David Chaum and David Chaum before anyone else wanted to create digital cash.
Are you aware with the double slit experiment in quantum physics?
Sure. Yeah.
Where like if you're looking at it, it can almost change what happens.
That appears to be the case. Yeah.
The idea of being observed changes the behavior of the actual down on almost a quantum physical level.
Yeah.
It kind of reminds me of this in a way. A lot of the points that Chaum made, and I had never heard this argument until I read your book, which is the idea that when everybody knows they're being watched, they behave differently.
Yeah.
And thinking back, I've watched documentaries on places like China, for example, and they just all know that they're being watched. So like listening to them talk in the documentary is almost like, you can't really trust what they're even saying. They're like, yeah, it's good that Big Brother, you know what I mean? They're like, and it's just, it's very wild. It's a very interesting thought, right? Especially when it comes to living in a free society.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
Freedom.
Privacy is essential to, freedom for that reason. Like it allows the freedom to be yourself.
Fascinating.
So Chaum, so he invented this in the 80s. In 83, indeed, he published the first paper, and there were 1-2 papers following it with where he sort of elaborated on the idea. But basically, to his own surprise, it didn't really catch on immediately. Like he put the ideas out there, but no one was very interested in implementing it. Then a couple of years later, in the 90s, or in 89, actually, I think, he was living in Amsterdam, so close to where I'm from. I'm from Utrecht, which is like half an hour from Amsterdam. And he was living there. He had a girlfriend there. And he was working for, it's called CWI. It's a Dutch...
CWI Research Center? Is that
yeah, exactly. It was a government-funded research center, data center, something like that. And The Dutch at the time, so in my country, there was this plan to install toll roads, toll booths, but they had to be automated. The plan was to automate them. So you would have a small device in your car, and then when you drove over certain roads, you would automatically pay. So you wouldn't have to stop and put a coin in some slit, but rather you would just drive, and automatically the machine would start paying for the roads you're on. Now, the Dutch didn't really like this idea because it's so bad for privacy. They didn't want everyone to know. They didn't want the government to know where everyone was driving their car all the time, right? So it was an unpopular idea for that reason. So the government, and by the way, just to flash forward a little bit, this plan was never actually installed because it was so unpopular. But at least the government made an effort to make it more private. So they were looking for a way to implement this while they would not be able to track where everyone's car is driving. So in essence, they were looking for an anonymous payment system. And at that point, Chaum said, hey, I have something for this. I have an idea. He called up a bunch of students from the Technical University in Eindhoven. I believe he knew one of their professors. And he said, guys, I got a job for you. If you help me out with this, if you help me out creating a proof of concept or a minimal viable product of, this toll system, then I'll take you guys to Disneyland in Florida. And also there was some sort of a computing contest that these students wanted to participate in, or they qualified for, or something along these lines. And David Chaum said, I'll pay for your trip if you help me with this week. So they got together and they hacked this thing together in a week, a minimal viable product, a proof of concept, and they got the job. And with that, David Chaum founded his company called DigiCash. So DigiCash was founded, I believe, in 1990, so 1 year later. And they would start to develop this toll system. But on top of that, David Chaum decided to use the company to also develop an actual digital cash system. So this cash system was called eCash, and it was designed for banks. So it worked much like I just explained with the envelope analogy. It was just what he invented a couple of years before that, and he was going to implement that for banks. So to clarify this, it was not its own currency in that sense. It was more of a payment layer for banks. So banks could adopt this, and then if the bank had guilders, which was the Dutch currency at the time, or US dollars for American banks, or Swiss francs for Swiss banks, people would just have fiat currency in their account, and then they could withdraw digital cash in that denomination from this bank, and then they could use this digital cash system. So this was a project that he started working on at DigiCash, and that was actually implemented at some point. So he finished that project, and he started to, try to sell it to banks. And there were a couple of really big banks that did adopt this. So in Germany, you had Deutsche Bank that adopted it, which is, of course, a major international bank. In the United States, you had Mark Twain Bank that adopted it. And then I believe in Switzerland, Credit Suisse, I believe, adopted it. And then a bunch of smaller ones here and there. So it was actually adopted. It could actually be used. There was actually a point in the 90s where a number of banks in different countries offered electronic cash, eCash. They also had a trial program, and this was called Cypherpunk'd.
This is the one I'm interested in.
Yeah, so they had Cypherpunk'd. This one, as a trial program, was not tied to any bank. It was just operated by DigiCash itself. But they made the promise, we'll only make 100 million of these. So we'll only ever issue 100 million Cypherpunk'd. It had a hard limit. It had a fixed supply. But it wasn't backed by anything. It was just
an idea.
Well, it was more than an idea. It was implemented.
Mm-hmm. But they would use it within their offices and stuff like that, like candy bars.
Exactly.
Would you consider this the very first cryptocurrency? When I think about it,
I think that's reasonable to say. Yeah. Especially if you take into account the unbacked nature of it, like that, it really can, and a fixed supply, it really can be seen as sort of the first sort of iteration of what would later become Bitcoin.
And correct me if I'm wrong, it actually had a tradable market somewhere at some point.
Yeah, so it was meant as a trial currency.
Kind of just for fun,
yeah, kind of for fun, for experimenting, for playing around with. But it did have this fixed supply. And people that were interested in digital cash start to experiment with it, start to use it, start to sell things for it even. And they start to just own it. And as a result, it gained some market value. So there was it was an unbacked digital cash. And it's important to point out that this was not a well-known idea at this time, that was even possible. It was not built with that intent. It was built as an experimental trial play money that no one would actually value. But people started to value it. People started using it, started to sell like gifts to each other or small trinkets, or we haven't gotten to that point in this podcast series yet, but Adam Beck at one point printed the RSA algorithm on a t-shirt, and he sold that for Cyberbucks as well.
Who made the decision to hard cap Cyberbucks? Do you know?
I would assume either David Chaum, or otherwise it would have been one of his employees, but I don't have the answer for you on that.
I'd be curious to know what the thought process was behind that. Who was involved in those discussions?
Yeah, I don't know. I don't have the answer to that.
It's a separate rabbit hole we're going to have to go down and do some research on.
At some point, yeah, you should have David Chaum on the podcast maybe.
I'm going to
have
try
the answer for you.
I'm going to try. I'd love to grill him and ask him all sorts of questions about his thought process and, how he evolved over time.
Yeah.
He's definitely a very interesting character, and he was very...
Oh, yeah.
He's very forward-thinking. I mean, he predicted so many different things that came to fruition.
So, yeah, you had Cyberbucks, which actually attracted some market value. And then you had these different banks, a couple of different banks implementing eCash themselves. And that was available for people to use. However, it didn't really take off. It was there. You could use it, but no one used it. Now, here you get into a slightly controversial point of the story or of the Genesis book. Because here, the reason why it failed depends on who you ask.
Interesting.
So, David Chaum, and also at least one former employee I spoke with, the more commercially focused, like the CTO or some job title like that, that was tasked with selling the product basically. He and David Chaum himself, they believed there was just no market for it. So they built the product, but there was no market for it. And there is a good reason to think that was true. Because look at other privacy technologies. Most people just don't care about privacy. And also, if banks are supposed to sell it, there's no real strong incentive for banks to do that. Like, why should they really care if people use privacy tools or not? As long as they're a customer at their bank.
Yeah, what does it matter?
Yeah, it doesn't matter.
It's none of their business, right?
No, in a way, it's better for
time. Now it's like, the bank wants to know everything you're doing with your money. What are you doing over here? It's unbelievable.
Well, in a way, that's better for the bank, right? If you don't use privacy, they could potentially sell that information, or they can keep better track of what their customers are doing.
Yeah.
So there was no incentive for banks really to promote it. And there was also no strong reason for many people to adopt it, again, because most people don't care about privacy. So if you're a merchant, why would you go through the extra effort of implementing this? What's the upside for you?
Our mission is to change that.
that is the goal eventually. Yeah. But at this time, if you're a bank, you just, or if you're a merchant, you just want to get paid. You don't care if you're getting paid privately or not.
I find it interesting though, because it's like, when we talk about the very beginning, you talk about the fact that like, for example, the Dutch population, they didn't want to be tracked with these, transponders. They didn't want the government knowing, where they were. I go down that rabbit hole and I think, that makes sense, right? Who wants, the government to have a tracker in their vehicle and know every little thing about it? I think people just largely don't understand the extent of how insidious many of these things are, the tracking and the violations of privacy.
Yeah, well, that's clearly intuitively, at least for most people, seemed bad.
Yeah.
That's why it was unpopular.
Yeah.
But when it comes to making payments, if you have digital cash, it's only useful for you if you can spend it. right?
Of course, yeah.
And if there's no merchant accepting it, you can't spend it.
Yeah, the chicken and egg problem.
Yes. So, and what's the argument for a merchant to go through the extra effort of implementing this? There's not a good reason for most merchants to want to go through with that or to put themselves up to that. So as a result, there's no places to spend it. And then for people, there's no reason to have it because they can spend it anywhere. And because no one has it, there's even less reason for merchants to implement it. So indeed, it's this chicken and egg problem. It didn't take off for that reason. Or at least that's Chaum's perspective. And that's at least one of the other employees that I spoke with. That's what I think. There was just no market for it. Now, there is another side of the story. Other employees, some of them which I also spoke with, they think that there was actually demand for it, but Chaum was not a good businessman. That's what they say. They say there was a lot of demand from big corporations, big companies, big businesses to adopt this technology, but Chaum was not someone who was capable of finalizing these deals.
We all have our strengths and weaknesses. It's
you would think
it's only human, right? We're only human.
Right. So some names that have been dropped that apparently were interested, very interested, or at least mildly interested, were Microsoft. They wanted to have it in every Windows computer, apparently, is the story.
Imagine how things would have changed had they gotten that deal through and Bill Gates had
might have changed history completely, or at least this part of history,
It seems like it, right?
Also, a couple of big Dutch banks, I think ABN AMRO, ING, they were interested. Maybe Rabobank, that's the big three in the Netherlands. Apparently they were interested, or at least some of them. MasterCard is said to have shown interest. At some point, Citibank. So they say there was actually a lot of interest. But David Chaum, on the last minute before signing a contract, started to demand changes to the contract.
Yeah.
And he was not able to build trust with these parties and these companies. And that's why it failed. So at some point within the DigiCash offices, they revolted. Mm-hmm. At some point they said, look, we built this great technology. It's ready for the world. We want it to be adopted. But you're just not able to make these deals. So we want to change. And this change would come in the form of a new CEO. So David Chaum essentially stepped back. And then a new CEO came in. I believe his name was John Nash. And he would take over the reins. Not short thereafter, they also moved the company offices to Silicon Valley to be sort of more in the middle of, where stuff was happening in this in the tech domain.
So he was from Visa. So it looks like Visa veteran Michael Nash.
Oh, Michael Nash.
Replaced Chaum. So it's interesting here. One of the employees said, and here's what you wrote here. It said that the same distrustful personality trait that made him a great cryptographer got in the way when Chaum wore his business hat. His paranoid nature would have him unable to build up business relationships, causing him to back out of business deals at the last moment. Yeah. So very interesting.
Yeah, so that's the other side of the story. Yeah. Now, which side of the story is true? I mean, I included both of them in the Genesis book. Yeah. Because I don't know which one is true. If I would have, because they really strongly disagree, some of these people, right? They really have different perspectives on what went wrong.
Interesting.
If I would have to guess, just, what do I know? But having spoken to some of these people and having done a lot of research in digital cash, obviously, my guess is both were probably true. Mm-hmm. I think there probably wasn't a lot of market demand, at least on a consumer level. And probably also David Chaum wasn't a great businessman in that sense. Like probably what these employees said was at least kind of right. But again, David Chaum definitely doesn't agree with that. There's two sides of that story, as I mentioned. Yeah. So in any case, DigiCash moved to Silicon Valley, and there it also never took off. Now, I want to highlight, or I want to emphasize, like DigiCash was a small startup in Amsterdam, but it was considered like a potentially future giant. Like the people that were involved with tech in the tech industry, everyone sort of knew about DigiCash. They all knew about this company, and they all saw it as the next best thing. So the next, Netscape was at that time.
I mean, if that Microsoft deal would have went through, I mean, if there's legs to that story, there's proof of that, or
it's very possible that it could have happened. Yeah, we'll never know. But just to give you that idea, that the general perception at that time within tech spheres was that DigiCash was the new hot startup to pay attention to. But it didn't work out. It didn't play out that way. In 1997, I believe, 1998 maybe. No, I'm gonna say 1997. DigiCash finally went bankrupt, and the whole project failed.
1998 filed for bankruptcy. Yeah.
1998. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. I think Chaum, his final thoughts on that was it was hard to get enough merchants to accept it so that you could get enough consumers to use it, or vice versa, Chaum recalled in 1999. And as the web grew, the average level of sophistication of users dropped. It was hard to explain the importance of privacy to them. That was his thought process.
Yeah. Yeah, so DigiCash failed, and it's maybe good to note, although we'll get to that more later as well. So, I'll just riff here. So the Cypherpunks initially also got very interested in digital cash, and specifically that meant eCash. They were interested in eCash in particular. But they couldn't experiment with it very freely because David Chaum had the patent. Yeah, so he did patent his technology, and therefore it was really only DigiCash that could use it. Although, as a small footnote, it is also true that David Chaum argues that he wasn't being that difficult with the patent. So, again, another point where there seems to be...
Did he ever sue anybody or go after anybody? Because I know a lot of the Cypherpunks...
Not that I know of.
Okay, so then I think his story kind of checks out there, because I know a lot of people were kind of
experimenting with it. Yeah, that's not in a commercial way, but definitely in an experimental way.
That makes sense.
Now, the important part of this story is that cyberbucks were used, right? That was the eCash implementation that they were playing around with at the DigiCash office, and that attracted some market value. When DigiCash went bankrupt, Cyberbucks disappeared because they were the bank of Cyberbucks. They were preventing double spending. So if you would want to use Cyberbucks, you would create the Cyberbuck. The Cyberbuck DigiCash would sign it, the envelope thing. You would pay me. I would give it back to.
So in other words, it
DigiCash.
Was a centralized server. There was centralization there. And that was the main point of attack. When they went down, the whole system ceased to exist.
Exactly. Yes. Okay. At that point, if you had Cyberbucks on your computer, there was no way you could spend it, because whoever you would spend it to couldn't check that it wasn't double spent. In other words, at that point, you could just copy it infinitively.
It's just like a picture on the internet at that point, or
right. Yeah. So at that point, the whole system just became useless overnight. Now that's an interesting point in digital cash history, because it really informed the people that were experimenting with this, the people that were playing around with this, what the dangers of centralization are. Yeah. Namely, the whole system can go down. Now, there's another aspect to it, which is that, and Nick Szabo pointed this out. We discussed Nick Szabo in one of the previous episodes.
Shelling out. We talked about.
So he worked at DigiCash for a brief moment in time. He was in Amsterdam at the office working. And he found that not only did the risk of the whole system being shut down exist, which happened in the end, he also found that this cap of 100 million, well, it was really just a promise from DigiCash.
Yeah, they could change that.
They could change it whenever they wanted.
Yeah,
they could fiddle around with the total supply. No one would ever find out, especially because eCash was so private. There wasn't like a public blockchain. It was just data on someone's computer that you would send around.
In the words of Nick, trusted third parties are security holes.
Well, so that's one of the places where he learned that. He learned that at the DigiCash offices, that trusted third parties are security holes. They can meddle with the system, and they are at risk of either shutting down themselves or being shut down. So that's where that comes from. It comes from DigiCash and Cyberbucks, quite specifically.
So I always heard that the government had something to do with shutting down DigiCash. Did you ever hear anything about that? Because I didn't really see anything in your book about that per se.
No, I think you're confusing that with eGold.
eGold, yeah.
So eGold.
But I thought DigiCash was getting some pressure at some point from the government. Is that not the case?
Not that I know of. They may have had some pressure, but there was another interesting little detail about eCash, which is that it wasn't fully private. The reason for that is that let's go back to the analogy with the envelope, and you're paying me, right?
Mm-hmm.
So what you can do if you want to de-anonymize me, and the bank wants to de-anonymize me, if both of you want to de-anonymize me, you can actually collaborate to make that happen. How? Well, you tell the bank which serial number the dollar bill has. So at that point, you give this dollar bill, you put it in an envelope, you give it to the bank signs it, gives it back to you, you take it out of the envelope, you give it to me. Now I give this dollar bill to the bank, it has this serial number on it. At the bank, I have an account. At the bank, I have a name. They know who I am. So now, if you tell the bank what the serial number is on the dollar bill, then now you guys know that it was me who got that payment, right? So let's say I'm trying to extort you. I kidnapped your wife, say, and I'm telling you, you got to pay me $1 million or else you'll never see her again. You give me the $1 million, I give it to the bank. The bank knows who I am, doesn't know that you paid me. But if you then communicate with the bank, you say, hey, this guy, whoever gives you this serial number, that person is trying to distort me. So I give it to the bank. Now the bank knows, this is the serial number I had to keep an eye for, I had to look for. Now the bank knows, okay, he tells you, you go to the police, whatever. Now I'm caught. So in that sense, DigiCash, eCash was actually not perfect in privacy. It didn't have perfect payee anonymity, as that is called. There were some other implementations of eCash that some of the cypherpunks were experimenting with, for example, that did have this privacy as well. But DigiCash itself did not. And that was in part because David Chaum explicitly wanted to prevent eCash from being abused in this way. So he made a compromise on privacy in order for it to not be abused for extortion, kidnapping, these kinds of things. Now, the cypherpunks were not happy with this. I mean, not that they like extortion but they like privacy. They thought privacy is the most important thing.
Yeah.
That's what we're trying to achieve here. So you can't have backdoors on this privacy.
They didn't want the government.
And yes, there are bad side effects of that, but that's worth having privacy. A world without privacy is worse. And our goal is to protect privacy. So we'll build something that actually does have that privacy. But eCash by David Chaum did not. So the eCash by David Chaum had this sort of backdoor. And I do think one of the reasons for that was also to sort of avoid this regulatory scrutiny, to make it more acceptable to regulators, which again is a very un-cypherpunk idea.
Yeah.
Like cypherpunks
So
didn't
here's
give
really
a damn.
the divide between Chaum and the cypherpunks, although
This is definitely a significant divide between them. Yeah, he thought the cypherpunks were too radical, and the cypherpunks were annoyed by David Chaum because he wasn't sharing his patents and he was making these compromises.
Yeah. Okay. But you can still see that there's a synergy there, that there's a mutually shared vision to some extent. But although very similar to the stuff that happened in the MIT lab, where there was this idea of free software and then open source, and there was a slightly different, ethos.
That's a pretty good analogy. Yeah. So David Chaum was a big inspiration for the cypherpunks, and eCash specifically was a big inspiration for the cypherpunks. But at the end of the day, the cypherpunks and David Chaum didn't always see eye to eye.
Yeah.
And David Chaum never subscribed to the cypherpunk mailing list or anything like that. He didn't consider himself a cypherpunk. So it was a big inspiration, but he was not one of them.
Makes sense. Whereas someone like Tim May would take this head on and basically say, yes, it does allow these bad things, just like every other technology, right? Just like the internet allows potentially bad things, just like driving a car could potentially cause a car crash, or any other technology. A gun could potentially, kill people. So people could die from a murderer or whoever, right? But it also allows you to have this protection, right?
Yeah, or even curtains. Like we all know that bad stuff can happen indoors when you close the curtains.
Yeah, exactly, right.
But we still accept that curtains are a very fundamental privacy technology.
Exactly.
That everyone is allowed to have, and most people do have.
Yeah. I always, whenever I come across somebody who says, why, I don't care. I'm not doing anything. Why do I need privacy? I asked, well, why are you wearing clothes? Do you go to the bathroom and just leave the door open and let I mean, these are just, things, ideas, concepts, philosophical things to think about, right?
Yeah, there's an interesting thing about privacy where everyone cares about it, but at the same time they don't seem to realize it, or they don't, or they say I have nothing to hide, but that's not how they act.
Exactly.
Everyone sort of acts like privacy matters, and it does,
Of course.
but in conversation it takes a while for people to realize that, or they don't realize that.
They have to really get down to the first principles, right?
Kinda, yeah. I don't know if any other. I mean, there's probably other examples of this, but privacy is a very, very widespread example where people act one way and say something else. I mean, everyone cares about privacy, but a lot of people don't immediately acknowledge or realize to what extent.
Before we go on to talk about like time chains, let's talk about eGold a little bit, because originally we hadn't planned to talk about it, but I think we should let's talk about it because I think it's an important project, and so there's information to be gleaned from that.
Yeah, absolutely. So I opened the Genesis book with a short story on eGold. It's the intro chapter essentially. So it's not a full chapter, but I do think it's a meaningful intro. So eGold was a project by Douglas Jackson. He's from around here. He's from somewhere in Florida. What was the
Melbourne, Florida.
Melbourne, yeah, that's it. So he was from Melbourne, Florida, or is still, I think. And he also wanted to create a digital cash for the internet. I think we're now talking like 97. Again, I might be off a year or two, but definitely around 97. And he was just interested in monetary reform, and he was a gold bug, basically. In short, he was a gold bug.
So he was an Austrian economist?
Yeah, I think you can say that. Goldbach, Austrian economist. Well, not an economist. He was a doctor, actually. He was an oncologist.
Yeah, he was.
But he was interested in money, so he was a Goldbach.
It's like, it blows my mind what they did to this guy. How it's very similar to what's happened to other people. It's like this guy was operating in good faith. They really weaponized the system. I mean, this guy's a doctor. He went to medical school.
Yeah, he was a doctor in the army at some point.
Yeah, he served his country. He tried to communicate with these different, and we see a lot of that now with the crypto industry at large. We see them, trying to work with regulators for common sense things, or discuss, hey, we're trying to run a business. We want to, how can we do this? And then you see this just terrible bad faith response.
Yeah, eGold is a very good example of that.
The weaponization of the system against someone who's, an honest broker, a good member of society, right?
Yeah, so what eGold was a digital payment system that was backed by gold. So specifically, Douglas Jackson run a company, and that company owned vaults, and in that vault he put gold. And then he issued digital tokens against the gold. This was managed just through a central server, but anyone could make an account there using only an email address, no KYC email type of stuff. All you need was an email address. And then you had an account on the eGold system. And then you could send eGold to other people. So if you owned eGold, you really had a claim on the gold in the vault. So then you could send it to someone else, and then that person would have to claim on the gold in the vault.
So very, very similar to how fiat currency started, in the sense of, it was a claim check on gold in a vault. This is a digital claims check of gold on the internet, right?
Yeah, pretty similar, indeed. So anyone could use that, and it was being used. It grew pretty fast. It was actually a relatively successful project. But it was probably also being abused. I say probably because Douglas Jackson, I don't know if he's downplaying it, but at least he says that, well, every electronic payment system was abused by, criminals in one way or another.
Which is true. I mean,
which is true. And eGold wasn't worse than others.
Yeah, I mean, today most of the, people use the U.S. dollar in its current form. Today, most crime occurs using, the U.S. dollar, right?
Right. Yeah, exactly. So he built this system. People start to use it. And to your point, as you pointed out, Douglas Jackson really kind of tried to play well with regulators. Mm-hmm. It wasn't his goal to create something that criminals could use. It was his goal to create an easily accessible form of digital cash that was backed by gold. He was a gold bug. He wanted people to use gold in a modern way. So he tried to play ball with regulators. He reached out to them. He worked with them. And every time he got a request, he just did what they asked. He gave them what they asked. But still, at some point, the Secret Service raided his office and his home on the claim that it was being abused for money laundering on a large scale. This sent Douglas Jackson. By the way, we're a couple years later now. So
I think we're in the early 2000s, mid 2000s.
yeah, so by 2004, I believe his office was raided and his home was raided. And he and his company were being sued for money laundering, in short. At some point, Douglas Jackson decided to go for a plea deal. I think the maximum sentence for, operating an unlicensed money transmitter and money laundering is like 30 years or so. Like you got to think like real big.
Wow.
It was a real big threat to basically his life, at least his freedom. And he decided to go for a plea deal. And he got 3 years of home arrest as a result. Of which 6 months was an ankle bracelet. And on top of that, he couldn't reopen, or he couldn't continue to operate eGold, because once you're a convicted felon,
they destroyed him.
You cannot run.
You can't get the money transmitter license
exactly
where you have.
Yeah. So he was sued for not having that license, and then he struck a plea deal, not realizing that also meant he would never be able to get that license. But that was the result. And as a consequence, eGold shut down. So again, an example of a centralized digital cash system that could get shut down and was shut down.
Trusted third parties are security holes.
So I start the Genesis book with that story for that reason, to sort of immediately paint a picture of what happens when you try to create a form of digital cash. And specifically, why Satoshi would have designed Bitcoin in such a way that it cannot be shut down. And probably also why he chose to remain anonymous.
Satoshi was very aware of these projects. He actually discussed them on the Bitcoin Talk forum. I think at one point he mentions eGold and DigiCash, if I'm correct.
Yeah, he definitely mentioned BitGold and B-Money. He said Bitcoin was an implementation of BitGold and B-Money. We haven't discussed BitGold and B-Money yet, but he mentioned it. And I'm pretty sure, I think you're right that he also
think just
mentioned
in a random forum post.
Yeah, I think he mentioned eGold.
It's just a random forum post. He actually says, you know,
he did seem aware of it.
It's, he says something about the centralized nature of these projects.
Yeah.
Was the reason they failed.
Yeah.
Let's go back and talk about Stornetta a little bit.
Yeah, so this is a different part of, I included in the same chapter as eCash, but really it's sort of a standalone story. So this is the story about the invention of blockchain, you could say. But specifically Scott Stornetta wanted to create, and now we're in, just for context, now we're in the 90s. Do you have the exact year in front of you?
I'm pulling it up right now. Let me see here.
I'm going to say 98, but again, I could be off by a year.
1989. So still.
Oh, yeah, you're right. Yeah, this is way earlier. Yeah, you're right.
So he started his new job. See, this is still before I was born. He started a job at Belcore, which I'm not super familiar with. What is Belcore?
Belcore was a research facility for the telecom industry, essentially. Mm-hmm. So the internet was, of course, just coming up, and they were one of the research institutes that was figuring out what to do with this new technology. That's a very broad way of putting it. 1989. At least I got the numbers right. I said 1998.
Yeah,
1989. That's right. Almost a decade off, but still got the numbers right.
The golden age of research.
Yeah. So he was hired there, and interestingly, because there was so much happening, so much development in the tech sphere with the internet and the emergence of personal computers and all of that, that basically he was told by his new employer, "Hey, you figure out what's interesting. You figure out what's interesting and go work on that." So
that's how we operate here as well.
Good.
That's why I'm doing this podcast.
Right. So what he wanted to work at was a time stamping system. So we've discovered we discussed previously that authentication was
He wanted to
invented.
attack this idea of solving. The problem he wanted to solve was this idea of forgery and how common it was.
Yeah, exactly. So because a digital document can, of course, just be copied.
Yeah.
It can easily be copied. And he wanted a way to establish when a document existed. Because that way, forgery becomes harder. You can say, hey, this document existed before this document, so this is the real one. You're looking at a copy. You're looking at a forgery. So he wants to create a form of digital timestamps. Digital time stamping, maybe I should say. He teams up with Stuart Haber.
Stuart Haber, I think was his boss, right?
Yeah, that was the guy that hired him, actually. And Stuart Haber was a cryptographer. And Scott Stornetta figured cryptography, that's an interesting field with a lot of development and a lot of promise. That's probably sort of the area where we should start looking for solutions to this problem. So they started to look for a solution, but they wanted a solution that was trustless. They like other forms of cryptography, like public key cryptography, like Merkle trees, like digital cash. They wanted something that didn't require trust, like the cryptography would have to stand on itself. But that turned out to be a big challenge because everything they could sort of think of, every solution they could think of, required basically a timestamping service. So you would send the document to a timestamping service, and then the timestamping service would say, yeah, okay, we got it. This thing exists now. But they wanted to create something that didn't require a service like this. And it was hard because even if you put someone else to sort of monitor if this service is being honest, well, now the service and this monitoring
Could collude.
Yeah, can collude. So you can add a couple of more sort of checks, but in the end, then you're just trusting a group instead of one person. But they didn't want any trust. And they thought about it, but they couldn't think of a solution. It seemed like fundamentally some level of trust in some sort of time-stamping agency was required. At some point, they even gave up. They gave up on the idea altogether. They said, okay, we thought about it a lot. We're two smart guys. We can't figure it out. It's probably just impossible. Now, to make sure that they didn't completely waste their time, they decided to still write a paper about it. They decided to write a paper to prove that it was impossible. As they were writing this paper, to sort of tackle all angles, Scott Stornetta realized that he was wrong. It was possible, at least in theory. So the theoretical solution was, okay, if you have one timestamping entity, that entity can cheat. If you have someone to monitor that timestamping agency, then they can collude and they can still cheat. If you add another person, they can all collude and they can still cheat. Mm-hmm. But let's keep going. What if you add another one and another one and another one and another one until everyone in the world is monitoring? If everyone in the world is checking that a document existed at a specific point in time, well, now no one can cheat anymore. Now it's impossible because everyone's part of the collusion. Mm-hmm. So they solved the problem in a sort of extreme way by letting everyone be part of the monitoring system. Okay, the practical way they implemented this, here they use Merkle trees. So we explained what Merkle trees are earlier. So I won't go into it in detail. But suffice to say, you can take a lot of data and then compact it into one Merkle root. So you just have one string of numbers. And with this one string of numbers, you can later prove which documents are included in there. So if I have a document and I put it in a Merkle tree, and then later on I see this other document pop out somewhere else and it looks like mine and it's a forgery, then I can show my document to the world and I can show where it exists in the Merkle tree. And if everyone kept track of when the Merkle root was published, then everyone now knows that that document existed in that point in time. Right? So they expanded on this idea. There were 3 papers, I believe, they published. So the first idea, let's see if I got a chronology here in memory. So the first idea was, as I just explained it, I think everyone just has this Merkle tree. But the important thing is that they then also figured out, well, you can attach Merkle trees to each other. So if you include the string, the Merkle root from the previous Merkle tree in the next Merkle tree.
Is this the idea of a hash chain?
Yeah. So you include the previous Merkle tree in the new Merkle tree, basically. And then that Merkle tree also has a root. And then you include that in the next Merkle tree. Now you're going to get a chain of hashes, so a chain of Merkle roots, and there's an order to them. Mm-hmm. Now, if everyone keeps track of that order, and there might be also an actual timestamp in the Merkle trees as well, then if you would try to change anything from any Merkle tree that came before it, it would affect every Merkle tree that would come after it. So there's no way to forge a document without changing the entire
history of getting everybody that's participating in, and this is central to how Bitcoin works as well.
Exactly. Right. This is basically you could say this was the first blockchain.
Yeah.
So one of the things you could do, and which they did do, is you can take this Merkle tree. It's a very compact string of data, and you publish it somewhere very publicly. So you don't actually give it to everyone in the world. That's impossible. But you can publish it in the New York Times. So then the New York Times every day has this tiny little number somewhere. Mm-hmm. And this tiny little number basically represents all the data that anyone in the world wanted to timestamp.
So I can't remember if this is in your book or not, but didn't they actually do this?
Yes. No, they did it. They did do this.
Yeah.
Yeah, this was actually a thing they implemented. So again, you have this document and you want to prove that it existed in a certain point in time. All you have to do is go back in the archives for the New York Times, or just publish it because people have it stored on their computer because it's compact, and that's possible. And then anyone can check that, yep, on January 7th, 1994, this document was included in the Merkle tree, in the time stamping service. So by allowing everyone to be part of monitoring this, by publishing this data in a Merkle tree publicly, anyone can always check when it existed. So that's how they solved the timestamping problem.
In the words of Stornetta, if we can essentially create a conspiracy so large that it included the entire world, then we would have, in fact, inverted the problem and created a trust-free system.
Yeah. So indeed, this is precisely what Bitcoin does, right?
Absolutely.
So you get Bitcoin, you get a block full of transactions. There's ultimately one hash to that block. That hash is used in the next block. And that's how all the blocks are tied together. That's how you get an order of transactions. Now, of course, Bitcoin also implemented hashing as an additional feature, but we'll get to that in another episode, I think. So that was another new insight by Satoshi. Mm-hmm. But this basic idea of hashing blocks of data in order to prove that data existed at some point in the past was invented by Scott Stornetta and Stuart Haber as far back as the 80s. Late 80s, mm-hmm. Early 90s maybe by the time they implemented it.
I think 1990, let's see here. It eventually led to the publication of their 1990 paper, How to Timestamp a Digital Document. So still before I was born.
Right.
So this concept of distributing trust is essentially what this is.
Yeah. Yeah, so to tie that in with the first part of the episode and the first part of the chapter in the Genesis book, one of the big pitfalls of eCash, of DigiCash, was that it was centralized. So you would have to trust the central party. And then Scott Stornetta and Stuart Haber, they thought of a way to decentralize trust in this way. So allowing everyone to check on everyone else is how you can avoid anyone from cheating or colluding. Everyone is part of the monitoring system.
The way I've always thought about it is like, you and me both like to play poker. I've always thought of it as like a giant poker table and everybody's watching, right? And when you need to push the pot to somebody, it's like nobody can just reach in and steal money from the pot because everybody's watching the pot at the same time.
Yeah.
Everyone's going to say, hey, no,
everyone keeps each other honest, right?
Yeah. Very interesting. What can you tell us about Dave Baer?
Yeah, so we went over this in part, and I didn't mention his name yet, but it's good you point that out, because what Scott Stornetta and Stuart Haber were thinking, at least in their first paper, was that each individual document would be hashed and linked in that way. So every time someone adds something to the timestamping project, so to say, it would be a new hash, and that would be hashed along with previous hashes. So every document would have its own hash and would change the chain of hashes. Actually, it was David Bayer who proposed the idea of using Merkle trees. So the problem with this system is that you end up with a ton of hashes. Like every hash is a document. Every document has a hash. Well, Dave Bayer, it was him who said, hey guys, you can use a Merkle tree for this. So you don't have to hash every document individually into the chain. Rather, you can have one new hash a day, and you include all the documents from that day, and you end up with one hash, and that becomes part of the chain. So you don't have a new entry in the chain every second for every document. Rather, you have one hash for every 10,000 documents or whatever it was. So the general idea that I just explained actually was already including Dave Bayer's idea. I just sort of made a shortcut there because the ultimate idea, as we now know, the blockchain idea uses Merkle trees. But yeah, that was Dave Bayer's big contribution to this concept. So Scott Stornetta and Stuart Haber came up with the idea of hashing in order, and then everyone checks everyone else, but it didn't scale very well. So then Dave Bayer said, hey, let's use a Merkle tree for this. Let's put all these documents in a Merkle tree, and it's a way more compact solution to do the same thing. You need way less data, and you still get the same result.
Very important because, instead of storing 10,000 bits of information per day, you can just store one, right? So
yeah,
Bitcoin operates similarly in a way, right? The blockchain is a limited amount of space. And Satoshi was very thoughtful about how he designed that base layer of Bitcoin with only one block every 10 minutes and it only taking up so much space because with the whole world looking at the same time and keeping track of this document, they have to have that history. So this really allows you to compact that a lot and still prove cryptographically that this is the truth.
Yeah, in the case of Bitcoin, it's a little bit complicated because you do actually need to see all transactions in order to be fully trustless. But because at the moment that you get paid, you need to know that your transaction was already spent. But in this case, for timestamps, you really only need to see the document if there is a dispute. So if there is a dispute, then someone can just say, hey, I got this document on July 31st. Does that date exist? I think so, yes. July 31st, 1992. And here's the Merkle tree and the data and the document to prove that. So that way, indeed, everyone wouldn't have to store every hash that's ever produced, which is really good because you want everyone to keep each other honest. So then you want to make that as easy as possible. You want to make it very lightweight to be able to do that. And Merkle trees were what's useful for that. And that was David Bayer's idea.
I guess my logic was
in general, indeed, blockchains and therefore Bitcoin builds on this topic completely. So basically, and to point that out, in the Bitcoin white paper, Stornetta and Haber's work was referenced like 3 times, and then there's a 4th reference, which itself builds on their ideas. So it's it's very obvious that Satoshi was aware of these ideas, and he used this type of technology. This type of timestamping system is what he used to build Bitcoin.
Fascinating. I'm going to close out with the last sentence of this chapter. The key to their success had been the distribution of trust.